Back in chapter 13, we were introduced to Jonathan, the firstborn of King Saul. We saw his courage and his faith in God in both chapters 13 and 14 as he attacked the Philistines on different occasions. Because of King Saul's repeated disobedience to God, he was rejected as king. In chapter 16, David was anointed as the next king of Israel, and then chapter 17, he defeated Goliath. In chapters 18 through 20, we see a relationship develop between David and Jonathan, while we simultaneously see King Saul become suspicious of David to the point that he begins trying to kill him on different occasions. The location of the events in these 3 chapters will be Gibeah, Saul's hometown and place of residence, and Ramah, which was Samuel's hometown. Chapter 18, verses 1 through 4 is the first section. It talks about David and Jonathan. You can pause the recording and read over that, glance over that again if you'd like. Question number 1 says, describe the friendship of David and Jonathan. Well, this was a friendship based on mutual respect. And Jonathan had such regard for David that he even gave him his royal clothing and his battle weapons. More is going to be said on this relationship because several questions are similar to this. Question number 2 says, when you consider what has been shown about the mind of Jonathan in chapter 14 and the mind of David in chapter 17, do you find this friendship difficult to understand? Well, it's not difficult to understand at all. Both men were courageous, but that sometimes produces jealousy and rivalry, and that's perhaps what prompted this question. But since both of these men had a deep faith and trust in God, their similarities drew them together. The next section covers chapter 18, verse 5 through chapter 19, verse 10. David's growing fame and Saul's reaction to it. You can pause and glance back over that if you'd like. Question number 3 says, describe David's growing fame. Well, his initial rise to popularity was immediate as a result of him killing Goliath. His fame continued to grow as he carried out further victorious conquests against the Philistines. Question number 4 says, how does Saul's hostility toward David begin? Well, it began when the women sang the song which attributed 10,000s of enemies' deaths to David and only thousands of enemies' deaths to Saul. This created not only jealousy in Saul, it also created suspicion that David had his eye on the throne. Question number 5 says, explain how Saul's question in verse 8 is related to chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, and chapter 15, verses 26 through 28. Well, Saul knew that the kingdom that God had, let me reword this. Let me look, I got my notes messed up here. Try that again. Saul knew that God had taken the kingdom from him, and he knew that it was going to be given to someone better than he. So based on David's display of courage and faith in God, it was the natural and logical conclusion that David was the one to whom God was going to give the kingdom. Question number 6 says, trace the development of Saul's attitude toward David so far as it is manifested in these verses. No doubt there was initial admiration, but after the Song of the Women there was probably jealousy and there was certainly suspicion. This grew into hatred and probably fear because he knew the Lord was watching over David. Question number 7 says, what was Saul's plan to get rid of David and how did it turn out? Well, he tried killing David himself. He himself tried killing David a few times, but he decided the Lord was with David. So Saul decided to let the Philistines kill David in battle, and so he appointed David to go out and fight battles against them. When David continued to be victorious against the Philistines, Saul tried to get Jonathan and his attendants to kill David. Every plan failed. Question number 8 says, according to chapter 19 and verse 1, to what extent did Saul's hostility toward David grow? Well, it grew to the point that he even tried to get his son involved in the murder plot, and I would think that would have to be pretty bad. Question number 9 says, what did Jonathan do in response to Saul's hostility toward David? Well, he defended David's loyalty and integrity, and he even reprimanded his father for wanting to kill David. And Saul relented temporarily. The next section is David's escape through the help of Michal, chapter 19, verses 11 through 17. You can pause and glance back over that if you'd like. Question number 10 says, who was Michal? How did she help David escape from Saul? Michal was one of King Saul's daughters, and she was David's wife. She learned of a plot against David's life, and she warned David to flee. But when the men came to take David, she put an idol in the bed and disguised it and told the men that David was sick. Question number 11 says, since according to its heading, Psalm 59 was written against the background of verses 11 through 17, what state of mind is reflected in this psalm? Well, it reflects David's trust and his confidence in the Lord and his lack of malice towards his enemies. The next section is David's escape at Ramah, chapter 19, verses 18 through 24. I'll give you a few seconds if you want to pause and glance over that. Question number 12 says, why did David go to Ramah? Well, he went there to escape from Saul and to consult Samuel about the situation with Saul. Question number 13, what prevented Saul from overtaking David? Each time Saul sent men to capture David, the Spirit of the Lord came upon them, and they prophesied. Finally, Saul decided to go to Ramah himself and take care of it, but the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he prophesied also. The next section, which is the last section, is the friendship of David and Jonathan, chapter 20, verses 1 through 42. Question number 14 says, how can the relationship between David and Jonathan be summarized and explained? Well, this is one that we've talked about earlier, but they held each other in mutual respect and high esteem. They both had a deep faith in God, and both were very courageous and willing to risk their lives in God's service and for others. Because they were both righteous men, they were not given to petty jealousy and competition. Question number 15 says, what understanding about David does Jonathan express in verses 13 through 16? He expressed the understanding that David would be the next king of Israel. Question number 16 says, describe the signal by which Jonathan would let David know what he should do. Well, Jonathan told David to wait by a certain large stone. After Jonathan determined how his dad was going to behave towards David, Jonathan would come out to shoot arrows, and he would bring someone with him to retrieve the arrows. If he said one thing to the boy about the arrows, it would mean everything is okay, it's safe. If he said a different thing to the boy, David would know that he had to flee for his life. Question number 17, the last one, is what suspicion did Saul begin to entertain in chapter 18, verse 18, and by verse 31, he held it as a matter of certainty. That suspicion was that David was going to occupy the throne after King Saul's death. When someone is living in disobedience to God, it affects the way he feels, it affects the way he thinks, affects the way he thinks about others. This is the unfortunate story of King Saul. It will be continued next week as we look at chapters 21 through 31. The title of that lesson will be Saul Pursues David.